Sometimes the most profound discoveries come from decades of patient watching, like a grandfather observing his family grow. For 30 years, mountain man Ezra Blackwood has noticed something strange about an old oak tree on his land, a bulge that keeps growing bigger each season. The folks in town think he's lost his mind, but Ezra knows trees better than most men know their own families. This oak has been hiding something for 3 decades, and today, with his old axe in hand, he's finally going to find out what. The discovery will change everything he thought he knew about his quiet mountain home and bring dangers he never expected. What he finds inside that tree will test everything he's learned in 70 years of living. But what could possibly be growing inside a living tree for 3 decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Colorado Rockies like memories refusing to fade, and Ezra Blackwood stood on his cabin porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of amber and rose. At 70 years old, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug with the same reverence he'd once reserved for holding his newborn grandson. The silence up here wasn't empty. It was full of whispers from wind through pine needles, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat that had kept time through 7 decades of living. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of aspen and pine, a sturdy log structure he'd built with his own hands. 43 years ago, when Sarah was still alive, and their dreams were as vast as the mountain views. The peaked roof bore cedar shingles that had weathered to silver grey, and the wide front porch held 2 rocking chairs, one worn smooth by use, the other gathering dust since the day Sarah drew her last breath 5 years ago. Ezra's chair creaked in a familiar rhythm as he settled into it, his hand instinctively reaching for the walking stick that leaned against the porch rail. The walking stick was a masterpiece of patient craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of ash wood he'd found after a lightning storm 15 years back. Every inch of its surface told a story, mountain peaks etched into the handle, a family of deer grazing along the shaft, and near the bottom, a detailed carving of Sarah's face, her gentle smile captured in wood grain and memory. He'd spent countless evenings working on it during those long winter months after her funeral, his hands needing something to do besides shake with grief. "Morning, old friend," he murmured to the hawk circling overhead, the same bird, or perhaps its offspring, that had greeted him from this porch for more years than he could count. The hawk's cry echoed off the canyon walls, a sound as familiar as his own voice. Down the winding dirt road that snaked through the valley, the town of Cedar Ridge was beginning to stir. Ezra could see threads of smoke rising from chimneys. Morning routines beginning in houses that seemed like matchboxes from his elevated perch. Cedar Ridge had grown from a handful of buildings when he first arrived to a modest town of 3,000 souls, most of whom knew Ezra Blackwood by reputation, if not by personal acquaintance. In town, they called him the Hermit of Hawk's Nest Mountain, though never to his face. The younger folks whispered stories about the strange old man who lived alone in the wilderness, who could track a deer for miles and read weather patterns like scripture. The older residents remembered him differently, as the best logger in 3 counties, a man who could fell a tree with surgical precision and who'd lost his beloved wife to a cancer that ate through her like fire through dry timber. Margaret Chen, the town librarian, was one of the few who still visited occasionally, bringing him books and news from the outside world. She understood his need for solitude, perhaps because her own husband had passed just 2 years ago. "Grief has its own geography," she'd told him once, "and sometimes you have to live in that territory until you find your way to somewhere else." But there was something else that kept the townspeople talking about Ezra Blackwood, something that made them tap their temples and shake their heads with knowing looks. For 30 years, 30 long years, He'd been obsessed with a single oak tree on his property, not just any tree, but an ancient giant that stood in a clearing about a quarter-mile from his cabin, its massive trunk easily 8 feet across, and its canopy spreading wide enough to shade a small house. The tree itself wasn't unusual. Colorado had plenty of old oak trees, survivors from an era when the climate was different and the ecosystem more diverse. What made this particular tree the subject of local folklore was the peculiar bulge that had appeared on its trunk 3 decades ago. A swelling in the bark that had started small, about the size of a man's fist, but had grown steadily larger. With each passing season, Ezra remembered the day he first noticed it, a crisp October morning in 1993. He'd been walking the boundary of his property, checking for storm damage after a particularly brutal wind had swept through the valley. Sarah had been with him, pointing out the changing colors of the aspen leaves and collecting pine cones for her autumn crafts. It was she who had spotted the odd protrusion. "Look at this, Ez," she'd called, running her hand over the bark. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like the tree is pregnant." They'd laughed about it then, speculating about what might cause such a strange growth. Sarah, ever the curious one, had wanted to investigate immediately, but Ezra's grandfather had taught him to respect the mysteries of the forest. Some secrets, the old man had said, reveal themselves in their own time. So they'd watched and waited, returning to the tree each season to measure its growth and marvel at nature's peculiar ways. The bulge had grown steadily, 2 inches, the first year, 3 the next, then settling into a consistent pattern of about 2.5 inches annually. Sarah had kept a journal of their observations, recording not just the measurements, but also changes in the tree's overall health, the wildlife that visited its branches, and her own theories about what might be happening beneath the bark. When Sarah passed 5 years ago, Ezra had continued the tradition alone, though the visits had become more solitary and contemplative. The bulge was now enormous, easily 3 feet across and jutting from the trunk like a wooden tumor. The bark around it had taken on a different texture, smoother and darker than the rest of the tree, as if whatever was growing inside was changing the very nature of the wood. The people in Cedar Ridge had their own theories, of course. At Murphy's diner, where the morning coffee crowd gathered to solve the world's problems, Ezra's obsession with the tree had become a running joke. Bill Murphy, the owner, would regale newcomers with tales of how crazy old Ezra measured that tree every month like clockwork, talking to it like it was a person and claiming it was growing something supernatural inside. "I tell you, that man's been alone on that mountain too long," Bill would say, wiping down the counter with practiced efficiency. "Talking to trees, measuring bumps in the bark. It ain't natural for a man to be so fixated on such things." Others were less charitable. Tom Garrett, who ran the hardware store and considered himself an expert on all things wood-related, insisted. The bulge was nothing more than a burl, a common tree deformity that could be valuable to woodworkers but was hardly worth 3 decades of obsession. "That old fool could have cut that burl out years ago and made himself a fortune selling it to furniture makers," Tom would grumble to anyone who'd listen. "Instead, he treats it like it's the Holy Grail or something." But Ezra paid little attention to the town gossip. He'd learned long ago that people talked about what they didn't understand, and his relationship with the mountain and its mysteries was something few could comprehend. His grandfather, a Scots-Irish immigrant who'd settled these mountains in the 1880s, had taught him that the wilderness held secrets beyond human understanding, that patience and respect were the keys to unlocking nature's deeper truths. "The mountain teaches those who listen," his grandfather used to say, his thick accent coloring the words with old-world wisdom. "But she's got no use for those who demand answers on their own schedule." Ezra had taken those lessons to heart, building a life that moved with the rhythms of the seasons rather than the artificial urgency of modern civilization. He grew his own vegetables, hunted and fished within legal limits, and cut enough firewood each autumn to last through the harshest winters. His needs were simple, his wants even simpler. The cabin reflected this philosophy, sturdy and functional, without being fancy. The main room served as kitchen, dining room and living area, dominated by a stone fireplace that Sarah had helped him build stone by stone. Their bedroom was small but comfortable, with windows facing east so they could wake with the sunrise. A smaller room had served as Sarah's craft space and now housed Ezra's few books and the tools of his woodworking hobby. Outside, a well-maintained garden produced tomatoes, beans, squash and herbs. Protected from deer by a fence Ezra repaired religiously each spring. A small barn housed his truck, a 1987 Chevy pickup that ran like the day he bought it, along with his tools, wood supplies, and the accumulation of 43 years of mountain living. But it was the oak tree that dominated his thoughts as he finished his morning coffee and prepared for the day ahead. Today felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't quite name. The dream that had awakened him before dawn lingered. In his mind, Sarah's voice calling to him from somewhere far away, telling him it was time, that the waiting was finally over. He'd been having the dream more frequently over the past month. Always the same sequence of events. He would find himself standing before the oak tree, but it was younger somehow, smaller, the way it had looked when he and Sarah first discovered the Bulge. Sarah would be there too, exactly as she'd been that October day 30 years ago. Her auburn hair catching the sunlight, and her green eyes bright with curiosity. In the dream, she would take his hand and lead him to the tree, pressing his palm against the Bulge. "Can you feel it?" she would ask, her voice carrying that note of wonder he'd loved so much. "Can you feel it calling to you?" And he could feel something, a warmth, a pulse, like a heartbeat deep within the wood. Then Sarah would fade away, but her voice would linger. "It's time, Ez. It's finally time." Ezra stood and stretched, his joints protesting the movement with familiar aches. At 70, his body reminded him daily of the years spent felling trees, building cabins, and living rough in mountain conditions. But his mind remained sharp, his instincts honed by decades of wilderness living. He gathered his empty coffee cup and headed inside, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Breakfast was simple. Eggs from his small flock of chickens, toast made from bread Margaret had brought him last week, and jam Sarah had canned from their wild berry bushes in what turned out to be her final summer. As he ate, Ezra's gaze drifted to the kitchen window that offered a partial view of the oak tree in the distance. Even from here, he could see the distinctive shape of the Bulge, dark against the lighter bark of the trunk. 30 years of watching, measuring, wondering, and still the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. But something was different today. The very air seemed to hum with possibility, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Ezra had learned to trust these feelings over the years. The subtle signals that preceded changes in weather, shifts in animal behavior, or simply the inexplicable sense that important moments were approaching. He finished his breakfast and washed the dishes, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full majesty of the mountain landscape that had been his home for more than 4 decades. Soon, he would make his monthly pilgrimage to the oak tree, tape measure in hand, to record whatever minimal growth the Bulge had experienced since his last visit. But first, he had a strange urge to visit the small bedroom where Sarah's presence still lingered in the fabric of their shared memories. On her dresser sat a collection of small treasures, smooth river stones, pressed flowers, and a jewelry box he'd made for their 10th wedding anniversary. He rarely opened it anymore, the memories it contained too precious and too painful for casual handling. Today, however, something drew him to the box, his weathered fingers tracing the carved initials on its lid, EB and SB, surrounded by a heart he'd whittled with painstaking care. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay the simple gold band that had encircled Sarah's finger for 38 years of marriage. A circle of love that death had broken, but not diminished. As he held the ring, memories flooded through him like spring runoff from the high peaks, Sarah's laughter echoing through these rooms, her gentle hands tending sick animals they'd rescued from the wilderness, her endless curiosity about every growing thing on their mountain. She would have been the first to encourage him to solve the mystery of the oak tree, to satisfy the questions that had puzzled them both for so many years. "What do you think, sweetheart?" he whispered to the empty room. "Is it finally time to find out what that old tree's been hiding?" The silence that answered him felt somehow different than usual, expectant rather than empty, as if Sarah's spirit was listening from whatever realm claimed those we love after they leave us behind. Ezra slipped Sarah's wedding ring into his shirt pocket, feeling its weight against his chest like a talisman. The morning had taken on an almost ceremonial quality, as if the mountain itself was preparing for something momentous. He pulled on his worn leather boots and reached for his grandfather's old hunting jacket, its canvas fabric soft with age. And countless adventures. The walk to the barn carried him past Sarah's herb garden, now wild but still fragrant with the ghosts of mint, sage, and lavender. Her presence seemed stronger today, walking beside him in the dappled shadows cast by the towering pines. When he reached the barn, he paused before the heavy wooden doors, his hand resting on the iron latch his grandfather had forged more than a century ago. Inside, the barn held the comfortable smell of aged wood, motor oil, and memories. His truck sat covered by a canvas top, surrounded by the tools and implements of a self-sufficient mountain life. But today, his attention was drawn to the far corner where his grandfather's workbench still stood, its surface scarred by decades of use. Hanging on the wall above it in a place of honor was the double-bit axe that had belonged to the old man. Ezra lifted the axe from its pegs with reverence. The hickory handle had been worn smooth by 3 generations of Blackwood hands, and the steel head still held their edge, despite being forged in the 1890s. His grandfather had taught him to care for tools like family members. They were extensions of a man's skill and character, deserving of respect and maintenance. The weight of the axe felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memories from his logging days when he could swing such a tool for hours without tiring. Those days were long past, but the knowledge remained, embedded in sinew and bone like rings in a tree trunk. He ran his thumb along the blade's edge, finding it still sharp enough to split kindling with surgical precision. "Well, old friend," he murmured to the axe, "looks like we've got some investigating to do." The walk through the forest to the oak tree followed a path worn by 30 years of regular visits. Ezra moved with the quiet confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness, his boots finding purchase on familiar roots and rocks without conscious thought. The morning air carried the scent of pine resin and wildflowers, punctuated by the calls of mountain birds beginning their daily routines. As he approached the clearing where the oak tree stood, Ezra felt his pulse quicken with an anticipation that surprised him. In all the years he'd been monitoring the tree's strange growth, he'd never seriously considered cutting into it. The idea had always seemed like a violation, a betrayal of the patient watching that had become almost sacred to him and Sarah. But Sarah's presence seemed stronger with each step, as if she were walking beside him through the dappled morning light. He could almost hear her voice, that note of gentle encouragement she'd used when coaxing him past his natural caution. "Sometimes, Ez," she used to say, "you have to take a chance to find the treasure." The oak tree stood in the center of the clearing like a monument to endurance, its massive trunk rising straight and true toward the canopy of leaves that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns. The bulge on its eastern face had grown to impressive proportions, nearly 3 feet across and projecting almost 2 feet from the trunk's natural curve. The bark around it had taken on an almost polished appearance, darker and smoother than the surrounding wood. Ezra circled the tree slowly, studying it from every angle as he'd done countless times before. But today, he was looking for something different. The best place to make his cut, the point where he could investigate the mystery without causing unnecessary damage to the ancient giant. His logger's eye automatically assessed the tree's health and structure, noting the robust growth and vibrant foliage that suggested whatever was causing the bulge hadn't harmed the oak's overall vitality. He placed his hand on the bulge, feeling the bark's unusual smoothness beneath his palm. For a moment, he could have sworn he felt something, a warmth, a subtle vibration, like a sleeping creature stirring to wakefulness. The sensation was so unexpected that he jerked his hand back, heart hammering with sudden adrenaline. "Easy, old man," he whispered to himself, forcing his breathing to slow. 30 years of wondering has got your imagination running wild. But as he stood there in the filtered sunlight, surrounded by the whisper of leaves and the distant call of birds, Ezra felt Sarah's presence more strongly than ever. He could picture her standing beside the tree, her eyes bright with curiosity, urging him to solve the mystery that had captivated them both for so many years. He selected a spot on the bulge, where the bark seemed thinnest, just below the growth's maximum projection. With practiced hands, he tested the axe's balance and weight, then positioned himself for the first cut. The moment felt ceremonial, like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The first swing bit into the bark with a satisfying thunk, sending chips of wood flying into the morning air. The sound echoed through the clearing, followed by an oddly profound silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ezra worked with careful precision, removing bark and outer wood in controlled cuts that gradually exposed the bulge's interior. What he found beneath the bark made him stop and stare in disbelief. Instead of the solid wood or diseased growth he'd expected, the interior of the bulge revealed a hollow space, a natural cavity that appeared to have been carefully sealed by the tree's own growth. And within that cavity, wrapped in what looked like oiled leather, was something that definitely didn't belong inside a living tree. Ezra set down the axe and leaned closer, his heart racing with excitement and disbelief. The leather wrapping was dark with age, but appeared intact, protected by the tree's embrace from decades of weather and decay. Whatever it contained was substantial, roughly the size of a large book or small package. With trembling fingers, he carefully extracted the wrapped object from its wooden hiding place. The leather felt supple despite its obvious age, and it was bound with what appeared to be rawhide strips that had somehow survived their long imprisonment. The package had weight to it, suggesting contents of some substance and importance. As he held the mysterious bundle, Ezra felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself, a story that had been waiting 3 decades to be revealed. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, full of the wonder and excitement she'd always brought to life's mysteries. He looked around the clearing, suddenly aware that this discovery would change everything. Whatever was wrapped in this ancient leather had been deliberately hidden, placed in the tree's hollow, and sealed away by someone who understood that living wood would grow around it, protecting it more effectively than any vault or safety deposit. Box. The implications were staggering. Someone, decades ago, had chosen this particular tree as a hiding place for something important enough to conceal with such elaborate care. They had counted on the oak's longevity and the bulge's gradual growth to keep their secret safe until someone with enough patience and determination finally investigated. That someone had turned out to be Ezra Blackwood, a man whose love for his wife and respect for nature's mysteries had led him to 30 years of careful observation. As he stood in the dappled sunlight, holding the leather-wrapped secret in his weathered hands, he realized that Sarah had been right all along. Sometimes the greatest treasures were hidden in plain sight, waiting for those patient enough to look beyond the obvious. The morning breeze stirred the oak's leaves above him, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance with anticipation. Whatever secrets the package contained, Ezra knew his quiet mountain life was about to become considerably more complicated. But as he thought of Sarah's enduring curiosity and his grandfather's teachings about respecting the land's mysteries, he felt ready to face whatever revelations awaited him. The tree had finally given up its secret, but Ezra suspected this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would test everything he'd learned about patience, wisdom, and the sometimes dangerous treasures that lay hidden in the wilderness he called home. Back in his cabin, Ezra sat at the kitchen table with the leather package before him, a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. The morning's discovery had left him both exhilarated and cautious. A lifetime of mountain living had taught him that extraordinary finds often came with unexpected complications. The leather wrapping was even more remarkable up close. Despite its obvious age, the material remained supple and intact, suggesting it had been treated with oils or other preservatives before being sealed in the tree. The rawhide bindings were knotted with a precision that spoke of careful planning, not hasty concealment. With the reverence of a man handling sacred artifacts, Ezra carefully worked at the knots. His weathered fingers, skilled from decades of rope work and fine craftsmanship, gradually loosened the ancient bindings without damaging the aged material. As the last knot gave way, the leather fell open, like the petals of a flower, revealing contents that made his breath catch in his throat. Inside the wrapping lay a collection of items that seemed to whisper of adventures and secrets from a bygone era. The centerpiece was a map case made of oiled canvas, its brass fittings green with patina, but still functional. Beside it rested what appeared to be surveying tools, a small compass, a measuring chain, and other instruments whose purposes Ezra could only guess at. But it was the map case that drew his immediate attention. The brass clasp opened with a soft click, revealing a series of hand-drawn maps on paper that had somehow survived its decades-long imprisonment. The topmost map showed a bird's-eye view of the very mountains where Ezra now lived, but with details and markings he'd never seen on any modern survey. The cartography was exquisite, drawn with the careful precision of someone who had personally traversed every ridge and valley depicted. Mountain peaks were rendered with artistic skill, streams and rivers traced with flowing lines, and forests indicated by tiny individual trees that suggested an artist's eye as well as a surveyor's accuracy. But what made Ezra's pulse quicken were the symbols scattered across the map, small X marks with notations beside them in a careful, educated hand. Some were marked with single letters, others with brief phrases that hinted at their significance: good water, shelter cave, elk crossing, and most intriguingly, mine entrance, JW and RB, 1863. The initials were repeated throughout the maps, always in connection with the marked locations. JW and RB, two people who had clearly spent considerable time mapping these mountains in extraordinary detail during the Civil War era. The dates on various notations ranged from 1862 to 1865, suggesting a multi-year surveying project of remarkable scope. Ezra spread the maps across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and mason jars. There were 5 maps in total, each covering a different section of the mountain range, but all connected to show a comprehensive view of nearly 100 square miles of wilderness. His own property was clearly marked, though the cabin obviously didn't exist in the mapmaker's time. Most fascinating was the abundance of mining-related symbols. The maps showed dozens of locations marked as prospects, claims, or active mines. Some were crossed out with heavy lines, suggesting they had been abandoned or proven unproductive. But others, particularly those marked with both JW and RB's initials, were highlighted with special attention and detailed notes about ore quality and extraction methods. As Ezra studied the maps, a picture began to emerge of 2 men, presumably J.W. and R.B., who had conducted an extensive survey of these mountains during the 1860s. The level of detail suggested they had spent years in the wilderness, mapping not just geographical features, but also natural resources, particularly gold and silver deposits. The implications were staggering. If these maps were accurate, the mountains around Cedar Ridge contained far more mineral wealth than anyone had suspected. Modern geological surveys had identified some mineralization in the area, but nothing approaching the systematic cataloging revealed in these hand-drawn charts. Ezra found his own property on the central map and traced the familiar landmarks. With his finger, the creek that ran through his lower pasture, the rocky outcrop where he'd built his shooting range, the natural clearing where the oak tree stood. The tree itself was marked with a small circle and the notation, "Cash Tree, 30 years growth needed." The phrase sent a chill down Ezra's spine. Someone in the 1860s had deliberately chosen that oak tree as a hiding place, calculating that 30 years of growth would seal their cash safely inside the expanding trunk. But 30 years from 1863 would have been 1893, long before Ezra was born, longer still before he'd acquired the property. The mystery deepened as he realized the cash had remained hidden for much longer than its creators had intended. Instead of 30 years, the tree had guarded its secret for more than a century and a half, waiting for someone patient enough to notice its unusual growth and curious enough to investigate. Among the other papers in the case, Ezra found what appeared to be correspondence, letters written in the same careful hand as the map notations. The paper was yellow with age, but still legible, and the letterhead bore the name Whitman Geological Survey Company, Denver, Colorado Territory. The letters were addressed to someone named Clara Whitman and signed by "Your devoted husband, Jonas." As Ezra read them, a story began to unfold of a man conducting dangerous work in hostile territory, mapping mineral resources while dodging claim jumpers and hostile forces during the chaos of the Civil War era. "My dearest Clara," read one letter, dated August 15, 1863, "Running Bear and his people continue to prove invaluable guides and partners in this endeavor. Their knowledge of these mountains surpasses anything our eastern maps could provide. We have identified 17 distinct mineral deposits of significant value, including a gold strike that may prove more substantial than anything yet discovered in Colorado Territory." Another letter, dated several months later, carried a more urgent tone. "The situation has become dangerous. Word of our discoveries has reached the wrong ears, and I fear we are being followed by men whose intentions are far from honorable. Running Bear suggests we cache our most important findings until the current troubles pass. I pray this letter reaches you safely, as I may not be able to write again for some time." The final letter in the collection was dated December 3, 1863, and its contents sent a chill through Ezra's blood. "Clara, if you are reading this, then I have not returned as planned. The maps and surveys represent years of work that could secure our family's future, but they have also made us targets. I have hidden the most valuable information where only someone with patience and wisdom will find it. Look for the growing tree, my love. Time itself will be the lock, and understanding will be the key." Ezra set down the letter with trembling hands, the implications crashing over him like an avalanche. Jonas Whitman had been murdered or driven away before he could retrieve his cash, leaving behind a widow who apparently never learned the location of her husband's hidden treasure. The maps and surveys that could have made the Whitman family wealthy had instead remained sealed in a growing tree for a century and a half. But now they rested on Ezra's kitchen table, their secrets finally revealed to someone who possessed both: the patience to notice the tree's unusual growth and the determination to investigate its mystery. The question was, what was he supposed to do with knowledge that could potentially disrupt his quiet mountain existence forever? Ezra's curiosity led him back to the oak tree that afternoon, this time with a more careful eye for additional secrets. The hollow he'd opened that morning was larger than he'd initially realized, and a thorough exploration with a flashlight revealed another wrapped bundle deeper within the tree's embrace. This second package was smaller but heavier, wrapped in the same oiled leather and bound with rawhide strips. When he carefully opened it back at his cabin, Ezra discovered Jonas Whitman's personal journal, a leather-bound book whose pages chronicled not just surveying notes, but the daily life and struggles of a man working in dangerous frontier conditions. The journal entries painted a vivid picture of Jonas Whitman as an educated man, driven by both scientific curiosity and the practical need to provide for his family. Early entries from 1862 described his excitement at winning a government contract to survey mineral resources in the Colorado Territory, work that would pay handsomely if completed successfully. June 12, 1862, read one early entry, met with Chief Running Bear of the Ute people today. Despite warnings from the territorial governor about savage Indians, I found him to be a man of remarkable intelligence and dignity. He speaks excellent English, learned from missionary schools, and his knowledge of these mountains is encyclopedic. We have reached an agreement. I will share 25% of any mineral rights discovered on traditional Ute lands, and his people will provide guidance and protection during my surveys. The partnership between Whitman and Running Bear clearly deepened over the months that followed. Later entries described not just professional collaboration, but genuine friendship and mutual respect. Running Bear's people had shown Whitman hidden valleys and secret passes, shared knowledge of seasonal weather patterns, and provided protection from the various threats that plagued the territory during the Civil War years. August 3, 1862, Whitman wrote, Running Bear showed me something today that defies easy description, a natural cave system that extends deep into the mountain with mineral formations unlike anything in my geological texts. The Ute people consider it sacred, a place where the earth spirits keep their treasures. Running Bear says his grandfather's grandfather once found gold nuggets the size of bird eggs in the deepest chambers. I have convinced him to let me survey the cave, with the understanding that any discoveries will be shared according to our agreement. But as 1862 turned to 1863, the journal entries took on a darker tone. Word of Whitman's discoveries had begun to spread, attracting attention from less honorable fortune seekers. References appeared to strangers asking questions in Denver, mysterious riders observed watching the survey camps, and equipment that went missing or was deliberately sabotaged. March 15, 1863, Whitman recorded with obvious concern. 3 men approached our camp today, claiming to be prospectors seeking guidance to good mineral sites. Their leader, a man named Thornton, had the look of a Confederate deserter, well-armed, poorly disciplined, and clearly accustomed to taking what he wanted rather than earning it. Running Bear does not trust them, and neither do I. We sent them away with false information about played-out claims to the north. The situation had deteriorated rapidly through the summer of 1863. Whitman's entries described several direct confrontations with claim jumpers, men who seemed to know far too much about the survey's discoveries. It became clear that someone was feeding information to these fortune hunters, possibly someone within the territorial government or the surveying company itself. July 20th, 1863, read one particularly troubling entry. We were followed again, today, by at least 4 riders who stayed just out of rifle range but made no effort to conceal their presence. Running Bear believes they are waiting for us to lead them to the cave system, the location of which we have managed to keep secret thus far. I have made the decision to suspend active surveying until these vultures move on to easier prey. But the vultures had not moved on. Instead, they had grown bolder, eventually forcing Whitman and his Ute allies to hide their most valuable discoveries and flee the territory. The journal's final entries described a desperate race against time to conceal years of work before hostile forces could seize it. November 28, 1863, Whitman wrote in what appeared to be his final journal entry. "Running Bear and I have completed our preparations. The most valuable maps and survey notes are cached in the growing tree, sealed by nature itself, where no human searcher will think to look. The sacred items belonging to Running Bear's people are hidden separately, in places known only to the Ute. If God wills it, Clara and I will return someday to claim what we have discovered. If not, perhaps someone more worthy will find these treasures in decades to come." Interspersed with the dramatic events were technical details that made Ezra's hands shake as he read them. Whitman had discovered what he believed to be one of the richest gold deposits in Colorado Territory, hidden in a cave system that remained unmapped by modern geological surveys. The engineer estimated the deposit could yield millions of dollars in gold at 1863 prices, an almost incomprehensible fortune by today's standards. But what struck Ezra most profoundly were Whitman's observations about his partnership with the Ute people. The surveyor had clearly come to see himself not just as a prospector, but as a guardian of resources that rightfully belonged to the indigenous people who had revealed them. Several entries discussed his intention to ensure the Ute received their full share of any eventual profits, even if it meant defying territorial law. September 5, 1863, Whitman had written, "Running Bear's people have lived in harmony with these mountains for countless generations. They understand that the earth's treasures are gifts to be used wisely, not plundered carelessly. If my surveys lead to mining operations, I am determined that the Ute will benefit as partners, not victims. Too many tribes have been cheated of their rightful inheritance by unscrupulous white men." The journal also contained detailed sketches and descriptions of sacred Ute artifacts that Running Bear had entrusted to Whitman's care during the dangerous period. A ceremonial peace pipe with silver inlays, turquoise jewelry of museum quality, and ancient tools whose craftsmanship rivaled anything produced by contemporary artisans. These items, according to the journal, were hidden separately from the maps and geological samples, in locations that only Running Bear and his most trusted advisors knew. As evening shadows lengthened across his cabin, Ezra sat surrounded by the most extraordinary discovery of his 70 years. The maps spread across his table represented not just potential wealth, but a historical treasure that could rewrite understanding of Colorado's territorial period. The partnership between Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear offered a rare glimpse of cooperation and mutual respect between white settlers and Native Americans during an era known more for conflict and exploitation. But with the treasure came responsibility and danger. If Whitman's fears had been justified, if word of the discovery had indeed reached the wrong ears, then revealing the cache's contents could attract the same kind of trouble that had driven its creators into hiding more than a century ago. Modern treasure hunters might be more sophisticated than Civil War-era claim jumpers, but they were probably no less ruthless when significant money was at stake. As he carefully rewrapped the journal and maps, Ezra noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near his driveway, left by a vehicle he didn't recognize. Someone had been watching his property, possibly observing his morning trip to the oak tree and his careful transportation of mysterious packages back to the cabin. The quiet mountain life he'd built with Sarah was about to become considerably more complicated. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Ezra's cabin. A black SUV with Colorado plates wound its way up the mountain road, its engine note unfamiliar in the wilderness silence. Ezra watched from his kitchen window as a well-dressed man in his 40s stepped out, adjusting an expensive-looking jacket and surveying the property with calculating eyes. The stranger moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, his polished boots and city clothes marking him as distinctly out of place in the mountain setting. When he knocked on Ezra's door, his smile was practiced and professional, the kind worn by salesmen and politicians. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Marcus Kane, representing Pinnacle Resource Development. The man extended a manicured hand. "I understand you've lived on this beautiful property for many years. I wonder if you might have a few minutes to discuss a business opportunity that could be quite lucrative for you." Ezra's grandfather had taught him to trust his instincts about people, and everything about Marcus Kane set off alarm bells. The man's eyes constantly scanned the property, noting details and assessing value with the practiced gaze of someone who specialized in acquisition. His casual mention of Ezra's long residency suggested research that went beyond simple business interest. "I'm not looking to sell," Ezra replied carefully, not inviting Kane inside. "Been here 43 years. Plan to stay 43 more. If the Lord's willing." Kane's laugh was hearty but hollow. "Oh, I'm not here about purchasing your land, Mr. Blackwood, though I must say you've maintained it beautifully. No, I represent investors interested in the historical and geological significance of this region. We've been researching territorial-era mining claims, and your property sits in an area of particular interest to our clients." The mention of mining claims made Ezra's chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "Don't know anything about mining. This has always been timber and grazing land as far as I know." Of course, Kane agreed smoothly. "But our research suggests there may have been some survey work done in this area during the 1860s. Mining surveys that were never properly filed with the territorial government. We're offering substantial finder's fees to local residents who can provide information about such historical documents." Kane reached into his jacket and produced a business card, along with what appeared to be a historical photograph. "This is Jonas Whitman, a surveyor who worked in this region during the Civil War period. Our clients believe he may have cached important documents somewhere in these mountains before his disappearance. Any information leading to the recovery of those documents would be worth a considerable sum to the right person." Ezra accepted the photograph with steady hands, though his heart was racing. The image showed a bearded man in 1860s attire standing beside surveying equipment, with mountains in the background that looked remarkably similar to the view from Ezra's front porch. The resemblance to some of the sketches in Whitman's journal was unmistakable. "Interesting historical document," Ezra said, handing back the photograph, "but I've never run across anything like that on my property. Been all over these mountains for decades, and I've got a good eye for anything unusual." Kane's smile remained fixed, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Of course, but sometimes historical artifacts can be hidden in the most unexpected places. A cache buried underground, sealed in a cave, or even concealed inside a tree that's grown around it over the decades." The specific mention of trees made Ezra's blood run cold, but he forced himself to maintain a puzzled expression. "Can't say I've noticed anything like that, though I suppose if something was hidden inside a tree, it might cause unusual growth patterns." "Exactly." Kane's enthusiasm seemed genuine now. "Bulges, swellings, anything that might indicate a foreign object sealed inside living wood. Our researchers believe Whitman was clever enough to use natural processes as protection for his cache." Ezra scratched his chin thoughtfully, playing the role of a simple mountain man considering an intriguing possibility. "Now that you mention it, there is one old oak tree on my property with a peculiar bulge. Been watching it grow for years, never thought much about it. You think that might be worth looking into?" Kane's eyes lit up with poorly concealed excitement. "It certainly could be. Would you mind showing me this tree? My clients would be very grateful for even the smallest lead." "Don't see why not," Ezra replied, playing his part carefully. "Though I should mention, it's quite a hike through rough country. Hope you brought better boots than those." 20 minutes later, Ezra led Kane along the forest path toward the oak. A tree, moving at a pace that had the city man breathing hard within a quarter mile. Kane's expensive leather shoes were clearly designed for boardrooms rather than mountain trails, and his business attire was already showing signs of contact with branches and brambles. "Quite remote," Kane panted as they climbed a particularly steep section of trail. "How often do you visit this tree?" "Oh, I check on it every month or so," Ezra replied casually. "Started keeping track of that bulge years ago, just out of curiosity. Wife used to joke that I was more interested in that tree than I was in her." Kane's interest sharpened. "Your wife, does she know about the tree as well?" "Sarah passed 5 years ago," Ezra said quietly. "Cancer. But yes, she was the one who first spotted the bulge. Had quite an eye for unusual things, my Sarah did." When they reached the clearing, Kane's reaction confirmed Ezra's suspicions about the man's true intentions. The visitor's eyes immediately fixed on the oak tree's distinctive bulge, and his professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing naked greed beneath the polished surface. "Remarkable," Kane breathed, circling the tree with obvious excitement. "The size, the shape, this is exactly what we've been looking for." He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs from multiple angles. "You really think there might be something inside?" Ezra asked, maintaining his role as an innocent property owner. "Seems hard to believe anything could survive being sealed up in a tree for so long." Kane was barely listening, his attention focused entirely on the bulge. "Oh, it's quite possible. Wood is an excellent preservative under the right conditions. Oiled leather, wax sealing, documents could remain intact for centuries inside a living tree." The man's expertise was revealing itself in ways he probably didn't intend. His knowledge of preservation techniques and his immediate recognition of the tree's significance suggested this wasn't casual historical research. Kane represented people who knew exactly what they were looking for and why it was valuable. "Of course," Kane continued, still photographing the tree, "any investigation would require your permission as the property owner. My clients would be prepared to offer substantial compensation for access rights, plus a percentage of any historical documents recovered." "How substantial?" Ezra asked, playing to Kane's assumptions about a simple mountain man's motivations. Kane quoted a figure that made Ezra whistle in apparent amazement. $50,000 just for permission to investigate, plus 25% of any artifacts recovered. It was enough money to tempt most people, and probably more than Kane thought a backwoods hermit had ever seen in one place. "That's quite generous," Ezra admitted, "though I'd want to think about it carefully. This tree's been part of my life for 30 years. Hate to see it damaged for something that might not even be there." "Completely understandable," Kane assured him. "Modern archaeological techniques can investigate without significant damage to the tree. We're not talking about crude excavation. This would be precision work by trained professionals." As they walked back toward the cabin, Kane continued his sales pitch, but Ezra was thinking about the implications. Kane's knowledge was too specific, his interest too focused, for this to be coincidental. Someone had been researching Jonas Whitman's disappearance for a long time, probably using resources and connections far beyond what any legitimate historical society could afford. The question was, how much did Kane actually know, and how far would he and his clients go to get what they wanted? Whitman's journal had made it clear that the original surveyor had been dealing with dangerous men willing to kill for treasure. Modern treasure hunters might use different methods, but their fundamental nature probably hadn't changed much in a century and a half. Back at the cabin, Kane handed Ezra an elegant business card with contact information for a Denver company Ezra had never heard of. "Think about our offer, Mr. Blackwood. This could be the discovery of a lifetime for both of us." As Kane's SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Ezra stood on his porch with a growing sense of unease. The peaceful isolation he'd treasured for 4 decades was about to be shattered, and the quiet mountain man was going to need all his grandfather's wisdom to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. 3 days after Kane's visit, Ezra made his first trip to Cedar Ridge in over a month, driving his old Chevy pickup down the winding mountain road with Whitman's maps carefully hidden beneath his truck's bench seat. The town looked the same. As always, weathered buildings clustered around Main Street, pickup trucks and SUVs parked at angles that suggested their drivers had more important things to worry about than precision parking. But Ezra noticed details that would have escaped. his attention before Kane's visit. A black sedan with tinted windows parked across from Murphy's diner, its occupant apparently reading a newspaper but positioned to observe everyone coming and going. Two men in expensive outdoor gear examining topographical maps at the general store, their clean equipment and soft hands marking them as city folk despite their wilderness costumes. Murphy's diner buzzed with the usual morning crowd, ranchers, loggers and retirees who gathered daily to solve the world's problems over coffee and gossip. But even here, Ezra sensed undercurrents he'd never noticed before. Conversations seemed to pause when he entered, and several people glanced at him with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that might have been concern. "Well, look what the mountain dragged down," called Bill Murphy from behind the encounter, his greeting carrying its usual mixture of affection and gentle mockery. "Haven't seen you in town for weeks, Ezra. Starting to wonder if you'd finally turned into one of those trees you're always talking to." The comment drew chuckles from the morning regulars, but Ezra caught an undertone he didn't like. Word of his tree obsession had clearly become more widespread than usual, probably thanks to Kane's inquiries around town. "Just came down for supplies," Ezra replied, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. "Coffee, and maybe some of Martha's. Apple pie if she's got any left. Always got pie for you, honey," Martha Murphy called from the kitchen. "Though I hear you've been having some interesting visitors up on that mountain of yours." The comment confirmed Ezra's suspicions. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, Kane's presence would have been noticed and discussed by half the population within hours of his arrival. The question was, how much Kane had revealed about his true intentions during his stay. "Fellow came by asking about historical documents," Ezra said carefully. "Seemed to think there might be old mining claims or survey records hidden somewhere. On my property. Can't imagine where he got such an idea." Tom Garrett looked up from his newspaper at the corner table. "That Kane fellow talked to me too, asking about old-timers who might know stories from territorial days. Offered good money for any information about a surveyor named Whitman who supposedly worked these mountains during the Civil War." The mention of Whitman by name made Ezra's coffee taste suddenly bitter. Kane had been more open about his research than Ezra had realized, which suggested either confidence or desperation. "Whitman," mused old Pete Harrison, a retired forest ranger whose knowledge of local history was legendary. "That name rings a bell. Seems like my grandfather used to tell stories about a surveyor who disappeared in these mountains sometime in the 1860s. Said he was working with the Ute Indians, mapping mineral deposits." "The Ute," added Margaret Chen, who had just entered the diner with an armload of books from the library. They had extensive knowledge of these mountains long before white settlers arrived. If someone was serious about mapping mineral resources, partnering with local tribes would have been the smart approach. Margaret's presence was exactly what Ezra had hoped for. As Cedar Ridge's head librarian and unofficial town historian, she possessed both the knowledge and discretion he would need to research Kane's background without arousing suspicion. "Margaret," Ezra said as she settled at the counter beside him, "you wouldn't happen to have any historical records about territorial-era mining surveys, would you? This Kane fellow got me curious about the history of my property." Her dark eyes studied him with the sharp intelligence that had made her an excellent librarian for 30 years. "I might have some resources. The Colorado Historical Society has been digitizing territorial records, and we received a grant last year to research indigenous partnerships during the mining era." "Speaking of which," Tom Garrett interjected, Kane was asking specifically about partnerships between white surveyors and Indian guides. Seemed real interested in any stories about joint ventures or shared mining claims. The conversation was revealing more than Ezra had expected, and not all of it was reassuring. Kane's inquiries had been thorough and specific, suggesting access to historical research that went far beyond casual treasure hunting. "I'd be interested in learning more about that history," Ezra told Margaret. "Maybe stop by the library later this week." "Of course," she replied, but her expression suggested she sensed undercurrents in his request. "I'll pull together whatever we have on territorial surveys and indigenous partnerships." As the morning crowd gradually dispersed to their various jobs and responsibilities, Ezra found himself alone with Margaret and the Murphys. The diner's atmosphere relaxed noticeably, and Margaret leaned closer to speak in a quieter voice. "Ezra, I need to tell you something about your Mr. Kane. After he left my library yesterday, I did some research on his company, Pinnacle Resource Development. The organization exists, but it's registered in Delaware with very limited public information. What I could find suggests they specialize in acquiring mineral rights and historical artifacts, often in circumstances that skirt the edges of legal gray areas." The confirmation of his suspicions sent a chill down Ezra's spine. "What kind of gray areas?" "Let's just say they've been involved in several disputes over Native American artifacts and mining claims on federal land. Nothing that resulted in criminal charges, but enough civil litigation to suggest they operate in ethically questionable territory." Martha Murphy had been listening while wiping down tables, and now she joined the conversation. "That Kane fellow gave me the creeps," she admitted. "Too smooth, too interested in things that weren't really his business. Asked a lot of questions about who owns what property, how long families have been here, that sort of thing. He offered me money for information about local legends and folklore," added Bill Murphy. "Said his clients were interested in preserving historical knowledge, but something about the way he asked made it feel more like he was looking for leads on treasure hunting than historical preservation." The picture that emerged from their collective observations was troubling. Kane represented interests that were both well-funded and ethically flexible, pursuing historical artifacts with methods that had attracted legal attention in other locations. If Whitman's cache was as valuable as the Surveyor's Journal suggested, Kane's clients would probably stop at very little to acquire it. "There's something else," Margaret said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Kane asked specifically about unusual tree growth on local properties, said he was researching historical caching methods used by territorial-era figures. "That's a very specific area of inquiry for someone supposedly interested in general historical preservation." Ezra felt the walls closing in around his secret. Kane's knowledge was too detailed, his questions too focused for coincidence. Someone had been researching Jonas Whitman's disappearance for a long time, probably using resources that included historical documents Ezra had never seen. "I think," Ezra said carefully, "I might benefit from learning more about Mr. Kane and his associates before I make any decisions about cooperation. Would you be willing to help me research his background more thoroughly?" Margaret's smile carried a hint of anticipation that reminded Ezra why she'd been such an effective librarian for so many years. "I thought you'd never ask. I've already started pulling together information on Pinnacle Resource Development and their previous projects. Some of what I've found is quite interesting." As Ezra left the diner an hour later, his mind was churning with new information and growing concerns. Kane's interest wasn't casual or coincidental. It was the result of extensive research and significant resources. The peaceful mountain hermit was going to need help from people he trusted if he hoped to protect Whitman's legacy from those who saw it only as a source of profit. The question was whether a 70-year-old man and a small-town librarian could outmaneuver professionals who had been playing this game much longer and with far fewer scruples about the methods they employed. 2 weeks after his conversation with Margaret, Ezra was returning from an early morning hunt when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks circled his cabin, not just the single set from Kane's visit, but multiple vehicles that had clearly conducted a systematic surveillance of his property. More disturbing was what he found near the oak tree. Someone had been digging around the base, their excavation careful but unmistakable. They had also installed what appeared to be a small electronic device in the tree's lower branches, a piece of technology that definitely didn't belong in his wilderness sanctuary. Ezra's logging experience had taught him to recognize equipment, and this device looked suspiciously like the GPS trackers used by wildlife researchers to monitor animal movements. Except in this case, the tracker appeared to be monitoring him, recording his visits to the tree and probably transmitting that information to receivers elsewhere. With growing unease, he began a systematic search of his property, looking for other signs of intrusion. What he found made him realize he'd seriously underestimated both Kane's resources and his determination. Hidden cameras had been positioned to monitor the approaches to his cabin. Motion sensors had been placed along the forest paths he used most frequently. His property had been turned into a surveillance network without his knowledge or consent. The most shocking discovery came when he found a small GPS device that had apparently fallen from his truck during Kane's visit. The device was still active, its LED indicator blinking steadily as it transmitted his location to unknown receivers. Kane hadn't just been asking questions during his visit, he'd been planting surveillance equipment. Back in his cabin, Ezra called Margaret from the landline phone he'd maintained, despite the availability of cellular service in the valley. The conversation that followed shattered his assumptions about the scope of the threat he was facing. "Ezra, I'm glad you called," Margaret said, her voice tight with concern. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. My research into Kane's background has uncovered some very disturbing information." "I'm listening," Ezra replied, settling into his kitchen chair with the phone cord stretched to its limit. Pinnacle Resource Development isn't just ethically questionable. They're part of a much larger network of companies involved in what can only be described as organized looting of historical artifacts. I found connections to black market antiquities, dealers, illegal excavations on federal land, and at least 3 cases where Native American sacred sites were ransacked for valuable items. The news hit Ezra like a physical blow. "Are you saying Kane is working for criminals?" "I'm saying Kane is working for people who consider laws and ethical boundaries to be obstacles rather than rules. They've been operating across the Southwest for at least 5 years, using sophisticated research and surveillance methods to locate historical treasures that others have missed." Margaret's voice carried a note of urgency that made Ezra's hands shake. "There's more, Ezra? I found evidence that they've been tracking you for months, possibly longer. Your name appears in surveillance reports dating back to last spring, long before Kane's visit. They've been watching your property, monitoring your routines, and gathering intelligence about your background." The implications crashed over Ezra like an avalanche. "How could they have known about the tree before I opened it?" "That's what worries me most," Margaret admitted. "Either they have access to historical documents we've never seen, or they have other sources of information about Jonas Whitman's cache, sources that might include descendants of the original claim jumpers who forced Whitman to hide his discoveries." Ezra felt the room spinning around him as the full scope of his situation became clear. He wasn't dealing with casual treasure hunters or even professional artifact thieves. He was up against an organization that had been researching Whitman's disappearance for years, using resources that included historical research, electronic surveillance, and probably criminal connections that stretched across multiple states. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," Ezra said, making a decision that would change everything. "Kane wasn't just fishing for information during his visit. I actually found something in that oak tree, something that matches exactly what he was looking for." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Margaret spoke again. "What did you find?" Ezra described his discovery in careful detail. The maps, the journal, the letters to Clara Whitman, and the evidence of Jonas Whitman's partnership with Chief Running Bear. As he talked, he could hear Margaret's sharp intake of breath and occasional murmurs of amazement. "Ezra, do you understand what you've discovered? Those maps and documents aren't just historically significant, they're potentially worth millions of dollars to the right collectors. And if Whitman's geological surveys are accurate, the mineral rights alone could be worth even more. I'm beginning to understand, Ezra replied grimly. The question is, what do I do about it? Margaret's response was immediate and firm. First, you get those documents somewhere safe, away from your property. If Kane's people are willing to conduct illegal surveillance, they won't hesitate to conduct an illegal search when they think you're not home. Already done, Ezra assured her. Everything's hidden in a place they'll never think to look. Good. Second, we need to contact the authorities. Not local law enforcement, but federal agents who specialize in antiquities theft and crimes on federal land. If Kane's organization has been operating across state lines, this becomes an FBI matter. The mention of federal involvement made Ezra's chest tighten with anxiety. At 70 years old, he'd lived his entire adult life avoiding government entanglements, preferring the simple independence of mountain living to the complications of bureaucratic oversight. There's a third option, Margaret continued, her voice carrying a note of steel that surprised him. We could set a trap. What kind of trap? Kane thinks you're a simple mountain hermit who doesn't understand the value of what he's found. We could use that assumption against him. Let him think you're willing to cooperate, draw his people into the open where they can be caught in the act of committing crimes. The idea had merit, but it also involved risks that made Ezra's survival instincts scream warnings. That sounds dangerous for both of us. It is dangerous, Margaret agreed. But consider the alternative. If we run to the FBI with this story, Kane's organization will disappear like smoke, probably taking their surveillance equipment with them. They'll wait until the investigation dies down, then come back with different identities and more careful methods. Meanwhile, other historical sites will be looted and other communities will be victimized. Ezra found himself thinking about Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear, two men who had faced similar choices more than a century ago. They had chosen to hide their discoveries rather than let them fall into the wrong hands, trusting that someone worthy would eventually find and protect them. What did you have in mind? He asked. Margaret's plan was both simple and audacious. Ezra would contact Kane and express interest in his offer, but with conditions that would require Kane's people to reveal the full scope of their operation. Meanwhile, Margaret would work with federal contacts to ensure law enforcement was positioned to document whatever crimes Kane's organization committed. The key, Margaret explained, is making them think they're in control while actually drawing them into a situation where their illegal methods become undeniable evidence against them. As Ezra listened to Margaret outline her strategy, he realized the quiet librarian possessed a devious intelligence that Kane had probably never suspected. Her plan would require careful timing and considerable nerve, but it offered the possibility of protecting Whitman's legacy while ensuring justice for the people who had been victimized by Kane's organization. There's one more thing, Margaret added. If we're going to do this, we need to contact the Ute Tribal Council. Those sacred artifacts Whitman mentioned in his journal belong to their people, regardless of who finds them. They deserve to know what we've discovered and to participate in any decisions about what happens next. The suggestion felt right to Ezra in a way that went beyond legal or ethical considerations. Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear had been partners in their original venture, sharing both risks and potential rewards. Any effort to honor their legacy should include the descendants of both men. All right, Ezra said, feeling the weight of decisions settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Let's set a trap for Mr. Kane and his friends, but we do this right. No shortcuts, no unnecessary risks, and everyone who has a legitimate claim to these discoveries gets treated fairly. As he hung up the phone, Ezra looked out his kitchen window toward the oak tree where this adventure had begun. The afternoon sun was painting the forest in shades of gold and amber, creating the kind of beauty that had drawn him to these mountains 4 decades ago. Soon, that peaceful solitude would be shattered by conflict and danger. But as he thought, About Jonas Whitman's courage and Chief Running Bear's wisdom, Ezra felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. Some treasures were worth fighting for, and some stories deserved to be told, regardless of the risks involved in telling them. The next morning brought visitors that Ezra hadn't expected, but welcomed more than he could have imagined. A convoy of 3 vehicles wound up his mountain road. Not the black SUVs he'd been watching for, but a collection of pickup trucks and a weathered Suburban that suggested people more interested in respect than intimidation. Joseph Running Bear stepped out of the lead truck with the quiet dignity that seemed to run in his family's bloodline. At 55, he carried himself with the same thoughtful strength that Jonas Whitman had described in his journal entries about the original Chief Running Bear. Behind him came 5 other members of the Ute Tribal Council, men and women whose faces reflected generations of wisdom and survival in these mountains. "Mr. Blackwood," Joseph said, extending his hand with formal courtesy. "Margaret Chen contacted our council about a discovery that may involve our people's heritage. We hoped you might have time to discuss the matter." Ezra shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a man who worked with his hands, despite his leadership responsibilities. "I was hoping you'd come. What Margaret and I found involves your ancestors as much as it involves mine." Over the next 2 hours, Ezra shared the complete story of his discovery, from his 30 years of watching the oak tree through his recent realization of Kane's surveillance network. He showed them photocopies of Whitman's maps and journal entries, carefully preserving the originals while allowing the tribal representatives to study every detail of their ancestors' partnership with the territorial surveyor. The reaction was everything Ezra had hoped for and more. Joseph Running Bear's eyes lit up with recognition as he studied Whitman's descriptions of Chief Running Bear's knowledge and character. The other council members passed the documents among themselves with the reverence due to sacred artifacts, discussing details in their native language before translating for Ezra's benefit. "These writings honor our people in ways that few white men's documents from that era ever did," explained Maria Running Bear, Joseph's sister and the council's cultural preservation specialist. Whitman understood that partnership meant equality, not exploitation. That was rare wisdom for his time. "The sacred items he describes," added council member Thomas Elkhorn, studying the journal entries about ceremonial artifacts. "Some of these have been missing from our people for more than a century. Our elders have stories about treasures that were hidden during the time of troubles, when the government was forcing tribes onto reservations." Joseph Running Bear leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Our ancestors trusted Whitman because he proved worthy of that trust. The question now is whether we can find a way to honor that partnership while protecting what belongs to our people." Margaret, who had arrived an hour earlier with files full of research on Kane's organization, spread additional documents across Ezra's kitchen table. "The federal agents I've contacted are very interested in Kane's operation, but they need evidence of actual crimes being committed. Right now, all they have are suspicions and civil litigation." "What kind of evidence would they need?" asked Joseph. "Documented theft of artifacts from federal or tribal land, transportation of stolen cultural items across state lines, or conspiracy to violate federal antiquities laws," Margaret replied. "The kind of evidence that would require catching Kane's people in the act." Thomas Elkhorn studied the surveillance photos Margaret had obtained through her federal contacts. "These people have been watching Ezra's property for months. They've planted electronic devices without permission. Isn't that already criminal?" "Probably," Margaret agreed, "but proving it would require admitting we know about the surveillance, which would alert Kane's organization that their cover is blown. They'd disappear before federal agents could gather enough evidence to prosecute." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of their situation. Kane's organization had been careful to operate in legal gray areas, using methods that were unethical but difficult to prosecute. Without evidence of clear criminal activity, federal law enforcement had limited ability to intervene. "There is another consideration," Maria Running Bear said quietly. "The sacred items that Whitman hid with our ancestors' permission, those belong to our people, regardless of who finds them. But the maps and mineral surveys represent Whitman's work and his family's inheritance. Any solution must honor both claims." Ezra found himself thinking about Sarah and her endless curiosity, about the tree's mystery. She would have loved this gathering, this coming together of different peoples to solve a puzzle that had endured for more than a century. Her spirit seemed to whisper encouragement as he made the decision that would change everything. "I have a proposal," Ezra said, standing to pace the small kitchen as he organized his thoughts. "We use Cain's greed and impatience against him, but we do it in a way that protects everyone's interests and gives federal agents the evidence they need." The plan that emerged from their discussion was audacious but elegant. Ezra would contact Cain and agree to his original proposal: investigation of the oak tree in exchange for substantial payment. But the investigation would be conducted under conditions that forced Cain's people to reveal their true methods and intentions. Margaret would coordinate with federal agents to ensure surveillance and documentation of whatever crimes Cain's organization committed. The tribal council would provide cultural expertise and legal standing to protect any Native American artifacts that were discovered. And Ezra would play the role of a simple mountain man who didn't fully understand the value of what he'd found. "The key," explained Joseph Running Bear, "is controlling the situation without letting Cain realize he's being controlled. Our ancestors were masters of this approach, appearing to cooperate while actually maintaining the advantage." Over the following week, the plan took shape with military precision. Margaret's federal contacts positioned surveillance teams in the area, disguised as researchers conducting environmental studies. Tribal council members established a discreet presence in Cedar Ridge, ready to respond if sacred artifacts were threatened. And Ezra made the phone call that would set everything in motion. Cain's response to Ezra's apparent change of heart was immediate and enthusiastic. Within 48 hours, a team of 6 people had arrived in Cedar Ridge, equipped with archaeological tools, metal detectors, and electronic equipment that suggested capabilities far beyond legitimate historical research. "Mr. Blackwood," Cain said, as he stood on Ezra's porch 3 days later, his smile broader and more genuine than during their first meeting. "I can't tell you how pleased my clients are that you've decided to cooperate. This could be the discovery that makes us all wealthy." Ezra played his role perfectly, the simple mountain man overwhelmed by the possibility of sudden riches. "Never thought that old tree might be hiding treasure. Sarah always said I should investigate, but I never imagined anything like this." Cain's team had established a base camp near the oak tree, their equipment suggesting a level of technological sophistication that went far beyond academic archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and computer analysis systems that belonged in a high-tech laboratory rather than a wilderness campsite. But it was what Ezra observed during his carefully casual visits to the site that confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions about Cain's organization. The team included specialists whose expertise clearly lay in extracting maximum value from historical sites rather than preserving their archaeological integrity. These people weren't researchers. They were sophisticated thieves using academic camouflage to conceal their true intentions. "The preliminary scans are very promising," Cain told Ezra during one of their conversations. "Our equipment is detecting significant metallic anomalies inside the tree, including what appear to be multiple caches of artifacts. This could be the find of the century." Ezra nodded with apparent amazement, while mentally cataloging evidence of the criminal enterprise unfolding on his property. Cain's people were using methods that violated federal antiquities laws, documenting their discoveries in ways that suggested black market sales rather than legitimate research, and making statements about ownership that ignored both tribal claims and proper legal procedures. The tension built steadily as Cain's team prepared for the final extraction of artifacts from the oak tree. Federal agents maintained their cover while documenting every violation of antiquities law. Tribal council members positioned themselves to respond immediately if sacred items were threatened, and Ezra felt the weight of responsibility for protecting both Whitman's legacy and Running Bear's heritage. On the morning when Cain's team planned to cut into the oak tree and extract its treasures, Ezra stood on his cabin porch with his grandfather's walking stick in his hand and Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket. The peaceful mountain morning carried the sound of equipment being tested and final preparations being made. In a few hours, the careful plan would either succeed in protecting the treasures that Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear had hidden more than a century ago, or it would fail spectacularly, leaving Ezra to face the consequences of trusting his 70-year-old judgment against professionals who had been playing this game much longer. As he watched the sun climb over the mountain peaks that had been his home for 4 decades, Ezra felt a profound sense of connection to the men who had faced similar choices in this same wilderness more than a century ago. Like them, he was about to discover whether wisdom and courage were enough to prevail against greed and corruption. The final act of a drama that had begun with Jonas Whitman's surveys was about to unfold, and Ezra Blackwood found himself standing at the center of a story that would determine whether the treasures of the past would be preserved for future generations or lost forever to those who saw them only as commodities to be exploited. The morning air crackled with tension as Cain's team began their final assault on the oak tree's secrets. Ezra watched from what appeared to be a respectful distance, playing his role as the simple mountain man, awed by the sophisticated equipment and professional expertise being deployed on his property. But beneath his carefully maintained facade of innocent curiosity, Ezra's mind was cataloguing every detail of the criminal enterprise unfolding before him. Cain's people worked with an efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in similar operations, their movements coordinated with military precision despite their academic pretenses. The scans confirm multiple metallic objects within the trees. "Core," announced Dr. Sarah Voss, Cain's lead archaeological specialist, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding expensive operations. "We're looking at what appears to be a deliberately constructed cache, possibly containing coins, jewelry, or other valuable artifacts." Cain rubbed his hands together with barely concealed excitement. "Excellent. How long until we can begin extraction?" 2 hours to set up the precision cutting equipment," Voss replied, consulting a tablet that displayed 3-dimensional images of the tree's interior. "We'll need to work carefully to avoid damaging whatever's inside, but our equipment should allow us to extract everything intact." Ezra nodded with apparent amazement, while secretly noting the conversation for the federal agents he knew were recording every word from their concealed surveillance positions. Cain's team was making no effort to follow proper archaeological protocols, obtain appropriate permits, or coordinate with tribal authorities about potential Native American artifacts. "Mr. Blackwood," Cain said, approaching with a contract and an expensive pen, "we'll need your signature on this agreement before we proceed. Standard archaeological research contract, giving my team permission to extract and analyze whatever we find." Ezra accepted the document with the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to legal paperwork, though his logger's experience had taught him to read contracts more carefully than Cain probably expected. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about the operation's true nature. The contract gave Cain's organization ownership rights to any artifacts discovered, with Ezra receiving only a small finder's fee, despite the treasures being located on his property. More telling was the language about private collection placement, and discretionary sales arrangements. Legal terminology that meant any discoveries would bypass museums and tribal authorities to be sold on the black market. "This seems pretty complicated," Ezra said, playing to Kane's expectations about his sophistication level. "Maybe I should have a lawyer look at this before I sign." Kane's smile remained fixed, but Ezra caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your caution, but we have a very narrow window of opportunity here. My team's equipment is expensive to maintain, and we can't afford delays that might compromise the discovery." The pressure tactics confirmed what Ezra had suspected. Kane's organization operated on tight schedules that left no room for the careful procedures required by legitimate archaeology. They needed to extract their treasures and disappear before anyone could question their methods or ownership claims. "I suppose you're right," Ezra replied, accepting the pen with apparent reluctance. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about something Dr. Voss mentioned. How do you know what's inside the tree without cutting it open?" Kane's team exchanged glances that suggested the question had hit uncomfortably close to sensitive information. Dr. Voss stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to deflecting awkward inquiries. "Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection technology have advanced considerably in recent years," she explained. "We can create detailed three-dimensional maps of subsurface objects without invasive investigation." But Ezra's grandfather had taught him to trust his instincts about people, and everything about Voss's explanation felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Her equipment was certainly sophisticated enough to detect metallic objects inside the tree, but her confidence about the cache's contents suggested knowledge that went beyond technological analysis. "That's fascinating," Ezra said, signing the contract with careful deliberation. "Though I have to wonder how you knew to look for a cache in this particular tree. I mean, there are thousands of old trees in these mountains." The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, carrying implications that made Kane's entire team suddenly uncomfortable. For several seconds, no one responded, their professional composure slipping just enough to reveal the careful planning that had preceded their arrival. "Historical research," Kane finally replied, his tone carrying a note of finality that suggested the subject was closed. "My clients have access to territorial-era documents that reference caching activities in this area," but Ezra wasn't finished probing their knowledge. "Documents like Jonas Whitman's surveys? I did some reading about territorial history after your first visit. Fascinating how that surveyor just disappeared without a trace." Kane's reaction was immediate and telling, a moment of genuine surprise followed by rapid calculation as he realized his quarry knew more than expected. The smooth, professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the predatory intelligence beneath. "You've been doing research," Kane said, his voice carrying a new note of wariness. "I'm impressed, Mr. Blackwood. Most people wouldn't have bothered to investigate the historical context." The moment felt like a chess match where both players had just realized their opponent was more skilled than initially apparent. Ezra maintained his facade of simple curiosity, but he could see Kane's team reassessing their assumptions about the simple mountain hermit they thought they were manipulating. As Dr. Voss began supervising the setup of cutting equipment, Ezra felt the familiar weight of his grandfather's Winchester rifle, carefully positioned within reach, but concealed from Kane's team. The weapon was more than a century old, but meticulously maintained. A family heirloom that represented 3 generations of Blackwood self-reliance. The peaceful morning was about to become considerably more dangerous. The first cut into the oak tree released a sound that seemed to echo through the mountain wilderness like a cry of pain. Ezra watched with growing tension as Kane's team worked with surgical precision, their expensive equipment reducing decades of natural growth to carefully controlled incisions. Remarkable preservation. Dr. Voss murmured, as the tree's interior was gradually exposed. The cache appears to be exactly as described in the historical documents. Kane leaned closer, his eyes bright with greed, as metallic objects became visible within the tree's heart. "Are those gold coins?" "Among other things," Voss confirmed, her voice tight with excitement. "I'm seeing what appears to be a substantial collection of 1860s-era gold pieces, along with jewelry and other artifacts." But as the extraction continued, Kane's team discovered something that changed the entire dynamic of their operation. Hidden deeper within the tree's core was a second cache, one that contained items clearly of Native American origin. Turquoise, a jewelry, carved ceremonial objects, and what appeared to be a peace pipe with silver inlays. "Boss," called one of Kane's assistants, his voice carrying a note of concern, "we've got a problem. These artifacts are obviously tribal in origin. If word gets out that we found Native American sacred objects," Kane cut him off with a sharp gesture. "We proceed as planned. The contract gives us ownership of everything discovered on this property." The callous dismissal of tribal claims triggered something deep within Ezra's sense of justice. Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear had been partners, sharing both risks and rewards in their original venture. Kane's organization was preparing to steal sacred artifacts that belonged to Running Bear's descendants. "Actually," Ezra said quietly, "I think you might want to reconsider that position." Kane turned to face him, irritation clear in his expression. "Mr. Blackwood, we have a signed contract." "That's probably not worth the paper it's printed on," interrupted a new voice from the edge of the clearing. Special Agent Diana Rodriguez of the FBI stepped into view, her badge clearly visible and her hand resting casually on her sidearm. Behind her came a team of federal agents who had been observing Kane's operation from concealed positions throughout the morning. "Mr. Kane," Rodriguez continued, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy to violate the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, theft of cultural artifacts from federal land, and transportation of stolen Native American religious objects across state lines." Kane's reaction was immediate and desperate. "You have no authority here. This is private property, and we have a signed contract. A contract obtained through fraud and misrepresentation," Rodriguez replied calmly. "We've been monitoring your organization's activities for 6 months, Mr. Kane. Your surveillance of Mr. Blackwood's property, your use of illegally obtained historical documents, and your previous thefts of tribal artifacts in Arizona and New Mexico have all been carefully documented. As federal agents moved to secure Kane's team, Joseph Running Bear and 3 other tribal council members emerged from the forest where they had been positioned as backup. Joseph carried an ornately carved staff that marked his authority as a tribal leader, and his presence added cultural weight to the law enforcement action. "The sacred items in that tree belong to my people," Joseph said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that had impressed Jonas Whitman more than a century earlier. "They were hidden by our ancestors during a time of great danger, with the understanding that they would be returned when it was safe to do so." Kane's composure finally cracked completely. "You people have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled, his professional mask slipping to reveal the ugly reality beneath. "My clients have invested years of research and substantial resources in this project. That cache represents millions of dollars in historical artifacts." "Exactly," Agent Rodriguez said as her team secured Kane in handcuffs. "Millions of dollars worth of cultural treasures that your organization planned to sell on the black market, with no regard for their historical significance or rightful ownership." Dr. Voss, meanwhile, had been quietly attempting to conceal some of the smaller artifacts in her equipment cases. Agent Rodriguez noticed the movement and signaled to her team, who quickly secured the attempted theft before any items could be smuggled away. "We'll need to conduct a complete inventory of everything," Discovered, Rodriguez explained to Ezra and Joseph, this is now a federal crime scene, but we'll work with both the property owner and the tribal council to ensure all legitimate claims are properly addressed. Ezra felt a profound sense of relief as Kane's team was led away in handcuffs. The peaceful mountain clearing would soon return to its natural quiet, but the oak tree's secret had finally been revealed in a way that honored both Jonas Whitman's intentions and Chief Running Bear's heritage. As the federal agents began their careful documentation of the cache's contents, Joseph Running Bear approached Ezra with an expression of deep gratitude. Your grandfather would be proud, Joseph said, extending his hand in friendship. You chose to honor the partnership between our peoples rather than pursuing personal profit. That takes wisdom and courage. Margaret Chen arrived with the Tribal Council's cultural preservation specialist, bringing equipment and expertise needed to properly document and preserve the Native American artifacts. Her smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had spent weeks orchestrating a complex operation that had succeeded beyond their best hopes. Kane's organization won't be stealing any more cultural treasures, she told Ezra. Agent Rodriguez says they have enough evidence to shut down the entire network and prosecute everyone involved. The ancient peace pipe that emerged from the tree's heart was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its silver inlays gleaming despite more than a century of concealment. When Joseph Running Bear held it with reverent hands, the connection between past and present seemed almost tangible. This belonged to my great-great-grandfather, Joseph said softly. Our oral histories describe it exactly, every detail of the silverwork, every symbol carved into the stone. It was hidden when the government forced our people onto reservations, with the hope that someday it could be returned to our ceremonies. Ezra watched the reunion between the tribal leader and his ancestors' sacred object with a sense of profound satisfaction. This was what Jonas Whitman had intended, that the treasures would eventually find their way to those who truly understood their value. The gold coins and mining surveys would require more complex legal resolution involving Whitman's descendants, federal authorities, and mineral rights regulations. But the immediate crisis was over, and the most sacred artifacts were being restored to their rightful guardians. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, Ezra stood beside the oak tree that had guarded its secrets for so many decades. The tree itself had been minimally damaged by the careful extraction, and would continue growing for generations to come, perhaps sheltering new mysteries for future adventurers to discover. Agent Rodriguez approached him as her team finished. Securing the crime scene. Mr. Blackwood, I want you to know that your cooperation was essential to this operation. Without your willingness to take risks and trust federal law enforcement, Kane's organization would have continued victimizing communities throughout the Southwest. The commendation felt good, but what satisfied Ezra most was knowing that Sarah would have been proud of his choices. Her spirit had guided him through the most difficult decisions, reminding him that some treasures were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. 6 months later, Ezra stood in the same clearing where his adventure had begun, but the landscape of his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined when he first took his axe to the mysterious oak tree. The tree itself had healed from the careful surgery that revealed its secrets, new bark already beginning to cover the incisions that had exposed more than a century of hidden history. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of the Colorado. Wilderness, bird calls, wind through pine needles, and the distant murmur of the creek that had guided Jonas Whitman and Chief Running Bear to this valley so many decades ago. But today, there were additional sounds that spoke of new purpose and renewed community. Margaret Chen stood near a wooden podium that had been erected for the ceremony, her arms full of documents and photographs that chronicled the remarkable partnership between a territorial surveyor and a Ute chief. Beside her, Joseph Running Bear wore traditional ceremonial dress that included the silver-inlaid peace pipe his great-great-grandfather had entrusted to Jonas Whitman's care. The crowd gathered in the clearing represented a convergence of interests that Ezra found deeply satisfying. Representatives from the Colorado Historical Society mingled with federal agents who had testified at Kane's trial. University professors studying indigenous partnerships during the territorial era compared notes with tribal elders whose oral histories had preserved details that no written documents contained. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of someone who had spent months organizing this event. "We're here today to dedicate the Whitman Running Bear Cultural Preservation Center, a partnership between the Ute Tribal Council, the state of Colorado, and the Blackwood Family Foundation." The foundation had been Ezra's idea, though the legal and administrative details had required expertise far beyond his mountain hermit capabilities. The gold coins discovered in the oak tree's cache had indeed proved valuable enough to fund an educational center that would preserve and share the story of cooperation between two remarkable men from different cultures. "This center," Margaret continued, "will house the maps, surveys, and correspondence that Jonas Whitman created during his partnership with Chief Running Bear, along with historical artifacts that tell the story of cross-cultural cooperation during one of the most challenging periods in Colorado's history." The building itself was modest but beautiful, constructed of local stone and timber using techniques that honored both Ute architectural traditions and the practical craftsmanship of territorial-era settlers. Solar panels and modern insulation ensured efficient operation, while traditional design elements created a structure that felt rooted in the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Joseph Running Bear stepped to the podium, his presence commanding the respectful attention of everyone gathered. "My ancestors understood that the earth's treasures belong to all people, but only when they are shared with wisdom and respect. Jonas Whitman proved worthy of that trust, and today we honor both men by ensuring their story continues to teach future generations." The ceremony included the formal return of sacred artifacts to the Ute people, items that would be displayed in the cultural center during appropriate seasons and used in tribal ceremonies according to traditional protocols. The legal complexities had required months of negotiation, but the final agreement satisfied everyone involved while setting precedents for similar situations throughout the Southwest. Agent Rodriguez, who had traveled from Denver for the ceremony, presented Ezra with a commendation from the FBI director for his cooperation in dismantling Kane's criminal organization. The investigation had led to prosecutions in 6 states, and the recovery of cultural artifacts worth millions of dollars. Mr. Blackwood's willingness to risk personal safety in order to protect cultural heritage represents the best of American values, Rodriguez said. His actions have preserved treasures that belong to all of us, while ensuring that those who would exploit our shared heritage face appropriate consequences. But for Ezra, the most meaningful part of the ceremony came when Maria Running Bear presented him with a hand-carved walking stick created by tribal artisans to replace his grandfather's old cane. The new stick bore carvings that told the story of his adventure, the oak tree, the hidden cache, and symbols representing the partnership between different peoples. "This walking stick," Maria explained, "carries the prayers of our people for your continued health and wisdom. It also carries our gratitude for choices that honored our ancestors and protected what is sacred to us." As the formal ceremony concluded, and people began to tour the new cultural center, Ezra found himself drawn back to the oak tree, where everything had started. The massive trunk still bore subtle scars from the extraction process, but new growth was already healing those wounds, just as time had healed the conflicts that once divided these mountains. Margaret joined him beside the tree, her expression reflecting the same mixture of satisfaction and wonder that Ezra felt. "Sarah would have loved this," she said quietly. "The partnership, the education center, the way everything worked out to honor everyone involved." Ezra nodded, feeling his wife's presence strongly in the mountain breeze that stirred the oak's leaves above them. She always said the best treasures were the ones that brought people together rather than driving them apart. The sound of young voices drew their attention to a group of school children who were beginning their tour of the cultural center. Their teacher, a young Ute woman who had recently graduated from the University of Colorado, was explaining how the partnership between Whitman and Running Bear had created a model for cross-cultural cooperation that remained relevant today. Sometimes, she was saying to her attentive students, the most important discoveries are about how different people can work together to protect what matters to everyone. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, Ezra walked slowly back toward his cabin, his new walking stick steady on the familiar path. The adventure that had begun with 30 years of patient observation had transformed his quiet mountain existence into something richer and more connected to the larger human story. The peaceful solitude he had treasured remained, but it was no longer the solitude of isolation. It was the solitude of someone who had found his place in a larger community, someone whose choices had honored both the past and the future. That evening, as he sat on his cabin porch watching the sunset paint, the mountain peaks in familiar shades of gold and amber, Ezra felt a profound sense of completion. The oak tree's secret had finally been revealed, but in ways that enriched rather than diminished the mystery of the wilderness he called home. In the distance, lights were beginning to appear in the windows of the new cultural center, where visitors could learn about the partnership between a territorial surveyor and a Ute chief who had understood that some treasures were worth more when shared than when hoarded. Beside the original oak tree, Ezra had planted a young sapling, an oak that would grow for centuries to come, perhaps sheltering new mysteries for future generations to discover with patience, wisdom, and respect for the stories that connected all people to the land they shared.